It's Mari McInerney from Croaky here at the National Climate Emergency Summit, and I have Carmen Lawrence here at the very end of the day. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Pleasure.
Carmen, for anyone who might not know you, could you just give a little bit of your background politically and your current work?
Yes, I'm a former state Member of Parliament, Premier of Western Australia and Treasurer at a certain time, and then I moved to federal politics and was a Health Minister in the Keating government, and then a period in opposition, as everyone must suffer. Then I left politics and have been working in the School of Psychological Science at the University of Western Australia, teaching and researching particularly on climate change, fire and a sense of place.
Can you say what brought you to that work
I was very interested in the effect the environment has on human beings, you know, the fact that we like to think of ourselves as separate from the natural world, but in fact are part of it. So that influences the way you think about the economy, it influences the way you think about things like climate change. And I had a number of wonderful PhD students who were interested in values and ideology and place attachment and how that affects people's perception of and action on climate change. So we've been beavering away at that for some time.
Great. Well, it'd be great to talk more about that work in a second, and particularly the intersection with health too.
Yes.
But first up, at the end of the conference, you and Ian Dunlop,
Yes.
Former coal industry advocate,
Yes.
Got up and gave notice of the declaration.
Yes.
Yeah? Can you just talk about what the conference declaration is?
I mean, after 2 days with a great many very smart people talking about the need to take urgent action, we thought it was important to try and capture the sense of what's been going on here with, you know, thousands of people contributing and many more not able to take part. It's obviously a movement that has momentum, representatives from across the board, and now we're keen to get them to go beyond this summit to their communities and to the wider community to push. The declaration is designed to push our national government in particular, but state governments too, to understand the threat that we're facing, that it is an emergency, and to take various actions to decarbonise, as it's said. In other words, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, to prevent the development of new industries based on fossil fuels, and to make sure that people who may in fact lose their employment because of that, and in fact in some cases inevitably will, regardless of what governments do, are properly protected in that process. So it contains all of those elements and many more, and we hope that as it goes online people will sign it, but more importantly take action with their local members of parliament, with would-be candidates, with whomever is making decisions about the use of various products that affect our climate.
That's great, thank you for that. And we'll be putting up the full declaration at Croaky, so I won't push you too much on that
on the
at the
detail,
moment, as it's only been drafted.
Yes.
But in the work that you're doing, you were just part of a session on crossing the divide, really, of how to mobilise communities that don't want to be mobilised at this stage on this issue.
Yes.
You talked about your background, that you're the daughter of a farmer, and that sort of influenced some of your thinking around that. Can you just talk through those things?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important that we don't demonise people who disagree with us. First of all, recognise the majority of Australians have and still do recognise climate change is real and that it's human-induced, and that there's a noisy minority who manage to convince other people that they are the majority. So we've got to, if you like, claim the ground. But in talking to people who are sceptical or worried about the effects it will have on their life and their livelihoods, it's important to start from a position of respect, and also to make sure that you talk people through what's likely to occur, but always asking them for their opinions, recognising their identity is often tied up in this. If you're a coal worker who spent your entire life working in the mines, and your father did, and maybe even your grandfather, this is more than just a job. And I think if we understand those things, whether we're talking to farmers or miners, and treat them with respect, and also ensure that they understand this is a question of harm. We're talking about reducing the harm to the Australian community and making sure that it's done fairly, that those values are ones that they also understand and which underpin many of their lives.
And you said in many cases, if you go in and talking about climate change from the start, it shuts things down.
That's right.
What opens it up?
Well, I think often asking people about what it is they value about their communities. We're doing research in Western Australia now with a colleague, Petra Checkett, who's a human geographer, and we're going into these communities all the way from Perth out to the remoter areas of Western Australia, finding out what it is that people like about their communities, what places they value, what threats they see to those places and values, and what it is that they think climate change is likely to to do to them. The climate change comes in last because we've already identified what matters to them, and very often they volunteer it. Droughts, floods, fire, they recognise all of these things as having an impact on them right now.
And there's, for many people, there's this paradox with that rural areas are still voting very much Conservative when people see that Conservative policies at the moment are not serving their interests from our perspectives.
Yes.
Do you think those approaches work at a political level?
I think they can. I mean, it takes a time for people to shift their political views, and sometimes they won't necessarily. So the important thing is that if a person wants to continue to vote, for instance, for the National Party or for the coalition more broadly, that they use their new understanding, which we hope they will have about climate change, to persuade their representatives. They don't have to change their ideology in other areas. We understand that very often they're deeply held and long-held views, but to do what some of the farmers are doing on climate change, for instance, and other groups representing rural communities saying, okay, we don't have to change everything we think about the political system, but we do want you as our local member to act on our behalf to protect us from what is otherwise impending and certain harm.
What were your reflections on, the election that Labor couldn't lose, this last one? And you talked about the Adani convoy, that
Yes.
you didn't think that was in any way helpful. What are your reflections, including on that?
Well, I think the debate has been somewhat narrow, and I think one of the other speakers made it pretty clear that the election results didn't turn on 2 seats in Queensland any more than they turned on the 2 seats in Tasmania, which were lost to Labor. So, we have to have a more careful, if you like, deconstruction of those, and I hope the Labor Party is doing that rather than relying on some of the media constructions of the election as being a climate change negative one, because I don't think that was true. The most serious proponent opposed to taking action on climate change lost his seat. So it depends where you look.
Yeah, that's right, and there were many individual seats that counted in particular ways.
It was a more complex election than that, and I'm sure that people in the Labor Party are looking harder, or at least I hope they are, than the headlines of some of the press.
What about health and climate change? Do you think that's the way to get to people's hearts?
It's one of the things that people really do care about, and anyone who's done any assessments of what predicts people's willingness to take action on climate change knows that, first of all, they have to see it as a threat, a serious threat, and so it's important to get that information out. But it's most likely to be effective, the messages are most likely to be effective when they are about threats to human health and well-being. So the OECD now is talking about using a well-being frame for talking about climate change, that you look at people's communities, because we know they care not only about what happens to them, but what happens to their communities, and particularly health as children are affected. So you've got the effects of disasters, clearly, and in Victoria we know the children who were affected by those terrible fires are still living with the consequences and still showing the effects. But we know also that air pollution in particular, from the burning of fossil fuels in our cities, has very destructive effects on our children, not to mention the effects of bushfires as we've seen in both Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra and surrounding areas. These are long-term effects that I think are now starting to worry serious-minded people, that these effects are not transient, that they can have very significant long-term effects. So health is one of those areas where people will pay attention and they will care.
And does that put a special responsibility and or opportunity to health professions?
Look, I think they're taking it. I think they've been, in many ways leading the charge on climate change. There's work that goes back decades now showing that the medical community well understood not just the obvious effects of things like air pollution, but also the effects of disasters, the effects on the changes to the distribution of various diseases, including mosquito-borne diseases. There's a very substantial research literature, but the medical profession and other allied professionals have shown themselves very concerned about the effects, mental health effects too, on communities where you have these disasters and where you have people worrying about climate change. You want them to be able to act. We need people to feel that they're powerful, that they can take action, because that in some respects is the antidote to anxiety.
Any other takeaways from this 2 days of very intense conversations?
Well, I think one of the wonderful things is the variety of people who are here. It can't be said to be the usual suspects. We've had people from all over Australia, from many different walks of life, different ages, not many of them probably in the usual, if you like, organisations that are front and foremost in climate change, but those two. So it's been a good mix.
Fantastic. And one final question, if I may. Are you wishing you were still in Canberra?
No.
Would you advise anyone to go there at the moment?
Well, look, I think there's a certain stage in your life when you can take it, but I'm past that now.
Fantastic, Carmen. Thank you very much
Pleasure.
for your time.